The thermometer outside the Silver Creek General Store read -38 degrees Fahrenheit when the wind stopped. That's when Emil Bergstrom knew they were in real trouble. Wind meant the blizzard was still moving. No wind meant it had settled in to stay. He looked down Main Street where snow had buried the hitching posts clear to the top rail, and he thought about the Norwegian woman living alone in that cave up Granite Ridge, the one they'd all laughed at 6 months back. Ingrid Halvorson had arrived in Silver Creek, Montana territory on September 14, 1887, with everything she owned packed into 2 canvas bags and a steamer trunk. She was 34 years old, widowed, and she'd walked the last 11 miles from the rail station in Billings because the stage fare would have cost her the money she needed for her land claim. The homestead office had 160 acres available 3 miles northwest of town, but when she'd hiked out to see it, she'd kept walking. Kept walking until she found the limestone cave set back in the ridge face, 40 feet deep with a southern exposure and a year-round spring trickling out from a crack in the back wall. The townspeople thought she'd lost her mind, but then they didn't know what she knew. Thomas Ridgway had been the first to speak up. He'd homesteaded in the Montana Territory since 1872, survived 5 winters in a drafty log cabin before he could afford to build proper. He'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite in the blizzard of '79, and he wasn't shy about showing people the stumps when he wanted to make a point. "That cave'll be colder than a stone tomb come January," he told her outside the land office. "Cold air sinks, missus. You're setting yourself up in a natural icebox." Ingrid had just nodded politely, signed her claim papers, and headed back up the ridge with her bags. Then there was Samuel Coughlin, the Irish stonemason who'd built half the foundations in Silver Creek. He had 23 years of experience working stone in Montana winters, and he'd seen plenty of settlers make foolish choices. "You can't build a cabin inside a cave," he'd said flatly. "Moisture'll rot any timber you put in there within 2 years. The limestone sweats water every spring thaw. I've seen it myself." Margaret Flynn, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the moral compass of Silver Creek's 87 residents, had concerns of a different nature. "A woman alone in the wilderness," she'd said, loud enough for the whole town to hear. "It isn't proper, it isn't safe, and when something happens to you out there, it'll be our Christian duty to risk our necks bringing back whatever the wolves leave." The fourth skeptic was a man named Joseph Beartooth, half Crow and half French-Canadian, who'd trapped and hunted these mountains for 30 years. He knew every cave system within 50 miles. "Cats use that cave," he'd told Ingrid in his quiet way. "Mountain lions. You'll smell their mark soon as you move in. They don't share territory kindly." But Ingrid Halvorson had grown up in a mountain valley in Norway, where winter temperatures dropped to -40 and stayed there for weeks. Her father had taught her something the Montana skeptics didn't know, that the earth itself was a furnace if you knew how to tap it. Underground temperatures stayed constant, around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, at depths below 8 feet. A properly designed, earth-sheltered dwelling didn't fight the cold. It borrowed warmth from the planet's core. She'd spent the first 3 weeks just studying the cave. The opening faced south-southeast, which meant maximum sun exposure during the short winter days. The overhang extended 14 feet from the cave mouth, providing natural protection from snow and rain. The spring water emerged from the back wall at a constant 52 degrees, never freezing even in the deepest cold. Most importantly, the cave narrowed from a 22-foot wide mouth to a 12-foot wide back chamber, creating a natural funnel shape that would trap warm air while allowing smoke to escape. October was her building month. She'd salvaged lumber from an abandoned claim 6 miles east, weathered pine boards that the original owner had hauled all the way from Missoula before giving up and heading back east. She built a false wall 15 feet inside the cave mouth, creating an airlock entry that would prevent heat loss. The wall wasn't just wood. She'd studied enough to know better. She packed the cavity between inner and outer boards with 11 inches of dried prairie grass mixed with clay, creating insulation the way Norwegian farmhouses had for centuries. The actual living space went deeper into the cave. She'd built a wooden floor elevated 8 inches above the stone, allowing air circulation underneath to prevent moisture rot. The ceiling beams she'd notched directly into natural limestone ledges, creating a framework that required no vertical supports. For the walls, she'd done something Thomas Ridgway would have considered crazy. She'd built them only 5 feet high, then angled them inward to meet the natural cave ceiling. Less wall surface meant less heat loss. Simple mathematics. By late October, she had a functional dwelling, 14 feet deep by 11 feet wide with a 6-foot ceiling at the center point. Small, yes. But the thermal mass of the surrounding limestone meant that any heat she generated, from cooking, from her own body, from a small fire, would be absorbed by the stone and radiated back slowly over hours. The wood stove was her masterpiece. She'd bought the smallest model available in Billings, a shepherd's stove designed for sheep herder wagons, measuring just 16 inches square. Most people would have called it inadequate. But she'd positioned it against the cave's back wall where the limestone absorbed the heat most efficiently, and she'd built a hood to capture smoke and direct it through a 6-inch pipe that ran along the ceiling and out through a carefully sealed opening near the cave mouth. The draft worked perfectly. She could heat her entire space to 65 degrees with 6 pounds of wood per day, about 1/10 what Thomas Ridgway burned in his drafty cabin. November brought the first tests. When temperatures outside dropped to 15 degrees, her cave stayed at 58 without any fire burning. The thermal mass effect was working exactly as she'd calculated. When she did light the stove for cooking, the temperature climbed to 68 within 20 minutes and stayed there for 3 hours after the fire died. The town watched with growing curiosity. Some folks started to wonder if maybe the crazy Norwegian woman knew something they didn't. Samuel Coughlin had been partly right about the moisture. The limestone did sweat during temperature changes. But Ingrid had anticipated this. She'd carved shallow drainage channels in the cave floor that directed water to a sump pit near the entrance, where it either evaporated or froze harmlessly away from her living area. She'd also treated all her floor timbers with a mixture of pine tar and beeswax, something she'd learned from a Danish shipwright in Christiania. The wood shed water like a duck's back. The mountain lion situation resolved itself in an unexpected way. Joseph Beartooth had been right. There were fresh lion marks in the cave when she'd first arrived, but Ingrid had hung bundles of dried sage and burned cedar bark regularly, scents that made the big cats uneasy. More importantly, her constant presence had simply convinced the lions to find easier territory. By December, the only tracks near her cave belonged to deer and the occasional fox. She'd built a root cellar by enlarging a natural depression in the cave floor, digging down 4 feet to where the temperature never varied from 48 degrees. She'd packed it with 60 pounds of potatoes, 30 pounds of carrots, turnips, dried beans, salt pork, and smoked venison she'd traded for with Joseph Beartooth. Her water supply was unlimited. The spring provided 3 gallons per day, more than enough for one person. If you're the kind of person who values practical knowledge over popular opinion, who understands that traditional wisdom often trumps modern assumptions, then you're exactly who we're creating these videos for. Subscribe to help preserve these frontier techniques before they're lost to history. December brought harder cold. Temperatures in Silver Creek dropped to 0, then -10, then -18 over the course of 2 weeks. The townspeople burned through their winter wood supplies faster than anticipated. Emil Bergstrom, who operated the general store and kept meticulous records, noted that firewood sales were running 40% higher than the previous winter. But up on Granite Ridge, Ingrid was comfortable. Her daily routine had settled into an efficient rhythm. She woke at dawn, started a small fire to warm water for coffee and oatmeal, then let the stove die down. The cave held heat so well that she didn't need to relight until evening. She spent her days mending clothes, reading by the light from the cave mouth, and every few days making the 3-mile walk into Silver Creek for supplies and mail. People noticed she looked healthier than most of them. While folks in town were developing the pale, pinched look of people who spent all their time huddled near stoves and drafty houses, Ingrid had color in her cheeks. She wasn't burning calories just trying to stay warm. Thomas Ridgway remained skeptical, but his tone had shifted from dismissive to puzzled. "It's early yet," he told people at the general store. "Wait until February. That's when the real cold comes. That's when we'll see if her little hole in the ground keeps working." Margaret Flynn had softened her position slightly. "Well, she hasn't frozen to death yet," she conceded, "but it still isn't proper for a woman alone like that. And when the heavy snows come, She'll be trapped up there. Ingrid had thought about snow access naturally. She'd cut and split an extra 2 cords of wood and stacked it inside the cave entrance. She'd also established 3 different routes down from the ridge, one direct path for clear weather, one longer but safer route for ice conditions, and one along the protected north side for use during heavy snow. She wasn't the type to leave things to chance. Christmas came and went. The town held a small celebration in the church, and Ingrid walked down to attend. She brought a gift for the collection, a beautifully knitted wool blanket she'd made using techniques from her mother. The pattern was Norwegian, intricate, and the quality was undeniable. Margaret Flynn had accepted it with visible surprise, running her fingers over the tight, even stitches. "You made this in that cave?" she'd asked. "Had plenty of light during the day," Ingrid had replied, "and plenty of time." The new year of 1888 arrived with unusual warmth. January temperatures hovered around 20 degrees, and people relaxed. Maybe this would be an easy winter after all. Emil Bergstrom noticed that the winter had been 30% warmer than average so far. The snow depth in town measured only 16 inches, manageable. Then, on January 19th, the temperature dropped 35 degrees in 12 hours. The blizzard that followed would be talked about for the next 50 years. It started just after midnight on January 20th. The wind came from the northwest, carrying snow so thick that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. By dawn, the temperature had fallen to -22. By noon, -31. The wind speed hit 40 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that made exposed skin freeze within 60 seconds, and then it settled in and stopped moving. The storm system had stalled over Montana territory, trapped between high-pressure systems to the east and west. It was going to sit there and dump snow until it ran out of moisture. Meteorologists wouldn't understand these patterns for another 30 years, but the old-timers in Silver Creek recognized the signs. When a blizzard went quiet like this, went still and heavy and cold, it meant it was digging in for days. Day 1 was manageable. People stayed inside, burned wood, waited it out. The snow depth reached 28 inches by nightfall. Temperature, -35. Day 2 brought problems. Several families were running low on firewood. They'd been burning through it so fast during the past 24 hours that their carefully calculated winter supplies were depleting faster than anticipated. Thomas Ridgway's cabin developed a crack in the chimney, letting smoke back into the house. He and his wife had to choose between freezing or suffocating. They chose to nearly freeze, keeping only the smallest fire burning and bundling under every blanket they owned. The snow depth hit 41 inches. Temperature, -37. The wind had died completely, which meant no fresh air circulation. Smoke from 30 chimneys hung in the air like a dirty fog. Day 3 was when people started to understand the real danger they were in. 4 families had completely run out of firewood. Samuel Coughlin tried to make it to the lumberyard to get more, but he couldn't move through snow that deep in air that cold. He made it 50 feet from his door before his lungs started burning from the frozen air, and he had to turn back. The Hendrickson family, a couple with 3 children under age 6, were burning furniture to stay warm. Snow depth, 47 inches. Temperature, -38. Emil Bergstrom opened the general store for 2 hours midday, trying to help coordinate resources. People who had extra blankets shared them with those who didn't. Families with spare rooms took in families who'd run out of fuel. But the mathematics were becoming clear. If this kept up for another 2 days, people were going to start suffering serious frostbite, maybe worse. Nobody had thought to check on the Norwegian woman in the cave. Day 4 brought the first medical emergency. Old Robert Crawford, age 71, had been trying to keep his wife warm in their poorly insulated cabin. He'd developed frostbite on both feet trying to fetch wood from his outdoor shed. Doc Hensley examined him and shook his head. The toes were black. In this cold, with no way to keep wounds clean, infection was almost certain. Robert might lose his feet. The snow had stopped falling, but the depth measured 51 inches, over 4 feet. Temperature, -39. The town was buried, frozen, and running out of options. That's when Margaret Flynn said what everyone had been thinking but nobody wanted to voice. Someone should check on that Halverson woman. She's been up there alone for 4 days in this. She's probably—" She didn't finish the sentence. Joseph Beartooth volunteered. He was the only one with both the skill and the equipment to make the climb in these conditions. He left at first light on the morning of day 5, strapping on snowshoes and carrying an emergency sled just in case. The climb that normally took 40 minutes took him nearly 3 hours, breaking trail through snow that came up to his waist, even with snowshoes. He approached the cave expecting the worst. Maybe he'd find her frozen. Maybe he'd find the cave collapsed from snow weight. Maybe he'd just find it abandoned, her body somewhere between there and town. What he found instead would change how every person in Silver Creek thought about building and survival. The cave entrance was completely visible. The overhang had protected it from snow accumulation, and Ingrid had clearly been keeping the immediate area around the entrance clear. He could see where she'd shoveled a path to maintain air circulation. Smoke was rising from the stovepipe. Not heavy smoke, just a thin, steady stream that indicated a small, efficient fire. He called out. A moment later, the door opened, and Ingrid Halverson stood there looking rested, healthy, and genuinely surprised to see him. "Mr. Beartooth," she said, "is everything all right in town?" Inside, the cave was warm. Joseph guessed around 64 degrees. The small stove glowed with a modest fire. The interior was neat, organized, comfortable. There was no ice on the walls, no moisture dripping from the ceiling, no smell of mildew or dampness. The air was fresh. The ventilation system was working perfectly. Ingrid had a pot of coffee warming and a book open on the small table she'd built. "How much wood have you burned?" Joseph asked, looking at her neatly stacked supply. "Maybe 30 pounds over the past 4 days," she said. "I've been keeping the fire small. The cave holds heat so well that I really don't need much." 30 pounds. Thomas Ridgway had burned through almost 400 pounds trying to heat his drafty cabin. The mathematics were stunning. "The town is in trouble," Joseph said quietly. "People are out of fuel. One man has frostbite. Families are burning furniture." Ingrid didn't hesitate. "How many people can we fit in here?" They worked it out quickly. The cave could accommodate 8 people comfortably, maybe 12 in an emergency. Ingrid had enough food supplies to feed them for 3 days. The water from the spring was unlimited, and the cave's thermal properties meant that even with a dozen people inside, she'd only need to burn maybe 50 pounds of wood per day, still a fraction of what they'd been burning trying to heat their individual homes. Joseph made the trip back to town and returned 2 hours later with 6 people, the Hendrickson family with their 3 children, and Robert Crawford with his wife. They were bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, but they were dangerously cold. The youngest Hendrickson child, a girl of 4, had gone quiet in that scary way that indicated early hypothermia. The transformation was immediate. Within 30 minutes of being inside the cave, color returned to their faces. Within an hour, they'd warmed enough to start removing layers. The little girl fell asleep in her mother's arms, and for the first time in 4 days, the parents allowed themselves to believe she'd be okay. Over the next 24 hours, Joseph made 3 more trips. By the evening of day 5, there were 14 people sheltering in Ingrid's cave. It should have been cramped, uncomfortable, tense. Instead, it was the warmest, safest place in 50 miles. The cave's thermal properties were so effective that even with 14 people, 3 sleeping on the floor, everyone was comfortable. Ingrid kept a rotating pot of soup going, carefully rationing her supplies but making sure everyone ate. The children played quietly in the back of the cave. The adults talked in low voices, and more than one person wept quietly in relief at simply being warm. Thomas Ridgway was among them. He sat near the stove, though he didn't really need to. The whole cave was warm, and ran his 3-fingered hand along the limestone wall. "I was wrong," he said finally. "Dead wrong. I've been building cabins for 15 years, and I never thought to work with the earth instead of against it." Samuel Coughlin examined Ingrid's moisture drainage system, her insulated walls, her efficient stove placement. "This is better engineering than most houses in town," he admitted. "You've thought of everything." Even Margaret Flynn softened. She watched Ingrid organize care for 14 people in a space the size of a large bedroom, doing it with such calm efficiency that it looked effortless. "You were meant for this life," Margaret said quietly. I see that now. The blizzard broke on the morning of day 6. The temperature climbed to -12, practically balmy by comparison. The snow began to settle and compact. By afternoon, pathways were passable. Over the next 2 days, people made their way back to their own homes, carrying with them a new understanding of how humans could live in harmony with their environment rather than fighting it. Robert Crawford's feet were saved. The warmth of the cave and Ingrid's careful attention, she'd made poultices from supplies in her root cellar, had prevented infection. Doc Hensley later said that if Robert had stayed in his own cabin another day, he'd have lost both feet for certain. If this story resonates with you, if you understand that survival isn't about fighting nature but about learning to work with it, then consider supporting what we're doing here. Hit that subscribe button. These aren't just entertaining stories. They're a record of practical wisdom that modern society has largely forgotten. Every subscription helps ensure these techniques are documented and preserved. The aftermath of the blizzard changed Silver Creek in measurable ways. By spring of 1888, 7 families had begun excavating into hillsides, creating earth-sheltered dwellings modeled on Ingrid's principles. Samuel Coughlin spent 3 weeks working with Ingrid to document her building methods, and he incorporated earth-sheltering techniques into every foundation he built from that point forward. He estimated that properly designed earth contact construction reduced heating costs by 60–70% compared to traditional above-ground cabins. Thomas Ridgway rebuilt his cabin that summer. The new design incorporated a bermed north wall, packed earth insulation, and a reduced ceiling height. All lessons learned from 5 days in a cave. His firewood consumption the following winter dropped from 4 cords to 1.5 cords, and his family stayed healthier because they weren't breathing smoke from an overtaxed stove. The town of Silver Creek grew to 134 residents by 1890, and it became known throughout Montana Territory for its innovative architecture. Travelers remarked on the unusual number of homes built partially underground or bermed into hillsides. The town weathered the brutal winter of 1889–90, which killed livestock and drove many Montana settlers back east, with remarkably few problems. Their heating costs were simply lower, which meant they could afford to keep adequate food and medical supplies. Ingrid Halvorsen lived in her cave home until 1903, when she was 50 years old. She never married again, and by all accounts, she preferred it that way. She became a sought-after advisor on earth-sheltered construction, traveling to help other settlers design efficient, sustainable dwellings. Her principles were simple: work with the Earth's natural temperature stability, minimize heat loss through strategic design, use thermal mass to your advantage, and never assume that the way things have always been done is the only way to do them. The cave itself became something of a landmark. After Ingrid moved to a larger home in town, she'd finally saved enough to afford it. The cave was maintained as a way station for travelers. It was still standing in 1945, still habitable, with the original timber and insulation intact. Samuel Coughlin's concerns about moisture rot had proven unfounded. Proper design and maintenance had kept the wood sound for over 50 years. Modern earth-sheltered architecture owes more to pioneers like Ingrid Halvorsen than most architects would acknowledge. The principles she employed, thermal mass, earth coupling, strategic insulation, minimal surface exposure, are the same ones used in contemporary underground and earth-bermed homes. Studies by the Underground Space Center at the University of Minnesota have confirmed that earth-sheltered homes maintain temperatures 15–20 degrees warmer than ambient air in winter and 10–15 degrees cooler in summer, with heating and cooling cost reductions of 50–80%. The technology isn't new, it's ancient, and it was being practiced by frontier settlers who couldn't afford to make mistakes. There's a photograph in the Montana Historical Society archives taken in 1892. It shows a group of 11 settlers standing in front of Ingrid's cave. They're the families who sheltered there during the 5-day blizzard. Every single one of them survived that winter. Every single one of them went on to build earth-sheltered or earth-enhanced homes. And every single one of them would tell you that a Norwegian widow with canvas bags and a crazy idea taught them more about survival than all their previous experience combined. The real genius of Ingrid's approach wasn't the cave itself. Caves existed long before humans. It was her willingness to observe, to question conventional wisdom, to trust mathematics and thermal principles over popular opinion. She'd understood that the Earth maintains a constant temperature at depth, that thermal mass is as valuable as insulation, that smaller spaces heat more efficiently than large ones, and that the best defense against extreme weather isn't thicker walls. It's working with natural systems instead of against them. She'd also understood something more profound, that survival in harsh environments requires humility. The humility to learn from other cultures. Her Norwegian heritage provided the foundation, but she'd incorporated techniques from Native American earth lodges and Scandinavian turf houses. The humility to admit that traditional pioneer construction might not be optimal for every situation. And the humility to keep learning, to keep refining, to accept that the first solution might not be the final solution. When Ingrid died in 1921 at age 68, her obituary in the Silver Creek Register noted that she'd helped design over 40 earth-sheltered dwellings across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota Territory. None of them had ever suffered a structural failure. All of them had reduced heating costs by at least half. And in every single one, the occupants had survived winters that killed people in conventional homes just miles away. Her original cave cabin had kept 14 people alive through a blizzard that could have been catastrophic, not through brute force or massive resource consumption, but through intelligent design and an understanding that nature isn't an enemy to overcome, it's a partner to work with. The stone is still there, up on Granite Ridge 3 miles from what's left of Silver Creek. The cave mouth faces south, just as it always did. The spring still trickles from the back wall at 52 degrees. The overhang still provides 14 feet of weather protection, and if you know where to look, you can still see the notches in the limestone where Ingrid anchored her ceiling beams 137 years ago. The question isn't whether her methods worked. 5 days in negative 40-degree weather proved that beyond doubt. The question is why we forgot. Why did a system that demonstrably saved lives and resources fall out of practice? Why did we decide that fighting nature with brute force and massive energy consumption was superior to working with natural thermal systems? Maybe because Ingrid's approach required something modern building has largely abandoned: patience, observation, and a willingness to learn from the land itself. She didn't impose a solution on the environment. She studied the environment and designed a solution that worked with it. That's not just smart building, that's wisdom. If you found value in this story, if it made you think differently about how humans can adapt to harsh environments, about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, about the practical genius of people we've too often dismissed, then this channel needs your support. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who appreciates real survival knowledge, not the flashy nonsense that passes for it today. These stories matter. These techniques matter. And the only way they survive is if people like you help preserve them. In the end, nobody believed Ingrid Halvorsen could build a cabin in a cave and survive a Montana winter. They believed what they'd always believed, what everyone around them believed, what conventional wisdom said was true, and they nearly froze to death for it. The woman they'd dismissed as crazy was the one who saved them, not with revolutionary technology or massive resources, but with observation, humility, and the willingness to trust that the earth itself might know more about staying warm than human stubbornness ever could. That's not just a survival story. That's a lesson in how wisdom survives when certainty fails, and that's worth remembering.